How do you defeat an enemy more ruthless than anything in the known or unknown galaxies? An enemy that multiplies with every battle, turning your fallen soldiers into its own. An enemy that anticipates your every move, where the loss of even one soldier could unravel your entire strategy. How do you confront a force so formidable that even your gods were brought to their knees? Today, we delve into the terrifying existence of the Flood. Where did the Flood come from? The Flood is one of the most terrifying and ancient threats in the Halo universe. This parasitic species is capable of infecting and transforming other life forms into monstrous versions of themselves, creating an ever-growing, ever-evolving army. The origins of the Flood date back over 100,000 years. Initially, the Flood was a highly advanced and intelligent species known as the Precursors. The Precursors were believed to be the architects of the galaxy, responsible for creating both the Forerunners and the human race. They wielded immense power and knowledge, shaping the development of sentient life across the Milky Way. The Precursors maintained a philosophy of unity and transcendence, guiding the evolution of species toward a higher state of being. However, a cataclysmic conflict arose between the Forerunners and the Precursors. The Forerunners, once loyal to their creators, grew fearful and resentful of the Precursors' immense power and influence. According to some accounts, the Precursors planned to pass the mantle of responsibility, a stewardship over all life in the galaxy, to humanity instead of the Forerunners. This perceived betrayal led the Forerunners to wage war against their creators, seeking to eradicate them entirely. In the aftermath of their near extinction, the few surviving Precursors made a desperate choice. They transformed themselves into a fine dust-like powder, intending to regenerate over time. However, this plan went horribly wrong. The powder became corrupted and mutated, giving rise to the parasitic entity now known as the Flood. This transformation marked the beginning of a new horrifying chapter in the galaxy's history. The Flood first emerged as a major threat during the Forerunner Flood War. Despite the Forerunners' advanced technology and military might, they struggled to contain and eradicate the Flood. The parasitic nature of the Flood allowed it to spread rapidly, infecting and assimilating sentient life forms, which it used to increase its numbers and evolve. As the Flood continued to spread, it became apparent that the Forerunners were losing the war. In a desperate measure to stop the Flood, the Forerunners activated the Halo Array, a series of massive ring-world superweapons designed to eliminate all sentient life in the galaxy, thereby starving the Flood of its food source. This drastic action wiped out nearly all life, including the Forerunners themselves, but succeeded in halting the Flood. Millennia later, during the events of the Halo game, humanity inadvertently reawakens the Flood by uncovering ancient Forerunner artifacts and installations. The Flood once again poses a grave threat, and the battle against it becomes a central focus of the series. Throughout the games, players encounter the Flood in various forms, from the horrifying infection forms to the massive tentacled Gravemind, which serves as the collective consciousness of the Flood. The history of the Flood is a tale of ancient conflict, desperate measures, and the relentless struggle for survival against a seemingly unstoppable force. Its reemergence in the Halo series reminds us of the enduring and ever-present danger that this parasitic species represents. So I imagine you're wondering, if the Flood are so terrifying and such a strong entity that was able to just wipe out the Forerunners with essentially no hardships at all, why is it that we're able to control the Flood infestation throughout Halo 3, Halo 2, and even arguably in Halo 1? Well, the reason for that is that there's actually 5 distinct phases the Flood go through in an infestation. The stage we're dealing with in the Halo titles is the Feral stage. The Feral stage is the initial stage of a Flood outbreak when the Flood first appear in an area, and at this point the Flood is uncoordinated and driven solely by basic survival instincts. Flood forms act independently and erratically, focusing on infecting and assimilating any available hosts without strategic coordination. And this primarily consists of infection forms and early combat forms. The second stage of a flood infestation is the coordinated stage, which you can kind of see in Halo 2 and 3 where they begin to create a Gravemind. The coordinated stage is essentially as the infestation grows, the flood begins to exhibit more coordinated behavior. This stage occurs when enough biomass has been assimilated to allow for rudimentary strategic thinking. Combat forms start to work together, and there's a notable increase in tactical behavior, such as ambushing and strategic placement of units. And the key entities in the coordinated stage include infection forms, combat forms, and carrier forms. Now, the third stage of a flood infestation that thankfully we barely see in the Halo titles is the centralized intelligence stage. This is the stage where a centralized intelligence, often a proto-Gravemind, begins to emerge. This entity starts to organize and direct the actions of the various flood forms more effectively. The flood exhibits increased strategic complexity with more organized attacks and better use of resources. The proto-Gravemind begins to exert influence over the infestation. And the key entities in the third stage of Flood's evolution include obviously the proto-Gravemind, along with more organized infection forms, combat forms, and carrier forms. Thankfully, we've also barely seen Stage 4, which is the Gravemind stage. The final stage of a mature flood infestation where a Gravemind has fully formed. This is a massive intelligent central entity that coordinates all flood activity with advanced strategic planning. The Gravemind directs all flood forms with high efficiency, employing complex strategies and manipulations. The flood becomes a highly cohesive and formidable force capable of large-scale operations and intricate tactics. And the key entities of the fourth stage obviously include the Gravemind, various specialized forms such as pure forms, and large numbers of infection forms, combat forms, and carrier forms. Now, we have absolutely never seen the fifth stage in the Flood's evolution in the Halo series, except through the talk about the Forerunners who kind of didn't make it. Anyways, the fifth stage of a flood infestation is the interstellar spread stage, and this is pretty much game over for any sentient life in the galaxy. If left unchecked, the flood can reach a stage where it begins to spread to other worlds and star systems. The flood, now under the control of a Gravemind, seeks to propagate its infestation beyond its current location, utilizing spacecraft and other means to transport spores and forms to new areas. And the key entities are the Gravemind, space-capable flood forms, and potentially large-scale coordinated assaults on interstellar targets. These stages illustrate the progression of a flood infestation from a chaotic initial outbreak to a highly organized and potentially galaxy-spanning threat. Now, throughout the Halo games, we begin to see the start of the fourth stage, which is the Gravemind stage. However, we're not able to see a fully formed Gravemind. Obviously, there's the massive hub on High Charity where the Gravemind begins to utilize a lot of the Covenant's technology to spread its entities across the galaxy. However, we're able to stop the Gravemind in its relatively early stages of this process. Had we let it progress to the fifth stage, which is the interstellar spread stage, it pretty much would have been over for everyone in the Halo galaxy. The interstellar spread stage is essentially what the Forerunners were fighting against, and they weren't even able to stop it. At times, the Forerunners were able to essentially slow down the flood, but that's all it ever really did. There was at one point where ancient humans believed they'd found a cure for the flood, and the flood ended up kind of strategically retreating for a little bit, but this was only due to them wanting to convince the humans their cure worked. In the end, it didn't actually work, and they watched as the Forerunners and the humans waged war against each other, which led to the weakening of both of their societies. The interstellar spread stage essentially means that the flood can just go anywhere. They've taken over enough ships to travel through space and attack planets as if they're a coordinated force. Again, thankfully we don't really see any of that in the Halo series. At one point, they are able to actually take control of a Covenant cruiser, which you see during Halo 3 on the mission Floodgate. However, thankfully, this is still in their rudimentary phase, and they aren't really able to understand how to effectively pilot the ship, and it crash lands into Earth. For all things considered, they start a relatively minor infestation in the city of Boy, which is in Kenya. And the issue with this is that even with it being such a small infestation, the Covenant and the Shipmaster, or, well, not really the Covenant at this point, but more like the Free Sangheili forces or the elites, are forced to glass virtually the entire continent, or at least a massive portion of the continent to contain the flood outbreak. So understanding that about half of a continent was destroyed by a singular flood ship making it into the orbit of Earth, think about how quickly the entire planet would have fallen had the entire High Charity home fleet somehow become infected by the flood. Obviously, we don't get any specific numbers for the High Charity home fleet, but throughout the campaign, there are different references that lead me to assume that it's over 2,000 ships that protect High Charity. And if the flood had access to every single one of these ships, Earth would have been nothing more than like a little bit of a bump along their journey to spread across the galaxy. And you have to keep in mind at this point, the Covenant and the Elites were both severely weakened due to the Great Schism that occurred in Halo 2. So they were already both fighting with completely reduced forces, and I think that if the Flood had managed to take control of more Covenant ships, they would have wiped out the Elites and absolutely destroyed what remained of the Covenant. Because again, at this point, the Covenant still wanted to fire the Halo rings so they could embark on their great journey, which effectively would have halted the flood again, but it also would have meant the end of all sentient life in the galaxy yet again. At the end of Halo 3, you're able to destroy the Gravemind on a half-finished ring, which is pretty much the only reason that the flood even gets stopped in the Halo franchise. But seeing as the reason for them existing in the first place is because the Covenant and the humans don't really understand where not to look in the galaxy, I think it's pretty safe to say we're going to see the return of the Flood in the newer Halo titles at some point. Not talking about Halo Infinite, they let pretty much every single one of us down. But I do think the next Halo game that comes out will hopefully see the return of the Flood. What makes the Flood such an effective fighting force is that they're truly not defeated until every single Flood spore has been destroyed. Because for most species in the Halo universe, obviously losing a majority of their forces would pretty much render them combat ineffective, whereas the Flood are able to lose every single one of their forces except a single spore, and if that spore is able to infect a living entity, it could hypothetically start an entire new infestation. And this is what makes the Flood so terrifying. The shipmaster Artas Vadum speaks about this in a specific cutscene. At first glance, this seems like just another case of exaggeration by Artas Vadum. However, as you see in Halo 2, a single UNSC frigate class arrives on High Charity carrying the Flood, and it's able to effectively
and you, shipmaster, just glassed half a continent. Maybe the Flood isn't all I should be worried about.
One single flood spore can destroy a species.
Between the Covenant and
Were
the
it not
Elites.
for the
But even then, it had a massive population that was able to effectively defend it regardless, and they couldn't slow down the Flood at all. So, if you take that into account and think about how outmatched the UNSC were in comparison to the Covenant, just imagine how quickly Earth would fall if they didn't have the Covenant or the elites there to glass Africa. The thing that makes the Flood so terrifyingly effective once they've reached the interstellar phase as well is that they're simply able to lob different amounts of flood spores at planets, and perhaps the first 10 or the first 500 don't effectively, take over a planet. However, when they have vast numbers and millions of infection forms to throw at a planet, eventually one of them will get through. And once that one gets through, then it's only a matter of time before that planet falls. The Forerunners attempted to stop this by creating shield worlds, which were essentially giant mechanical planets that were designed to fight the Flood with each individual part of the planet. It had a giant metallic dome around it, and each part of that dome could actually detach itself and become a sentinel. A sentinel was essentially like an automated turret that the Forerunners used to defeat the Flood. They didn't have any specific neural cortex or any brain activity, so it was very difficult, if possible at all, for the Flood to infect a sentinel. However, even with this massive amount of preparation, the Forerunners couldn't stop the Flood. The Didact essentially wanted to create a ton of these shield worlds, while a lot of the other Forerunners didn't agree with his strategy. This led to a massive division between their plans, which absolutely contributed to their defeat in the war against the Flood, but I think even if they had all been united under a singular plan, they probably wouldn't have stopped the Flood regardless, as with each day that passed and each Forerunner that fell to the Flood continued to gain knowledge and know more and more about the intricacies of the Forerunner defenses. And keep in mind that the Forerunners again were essentially the most technologically advanced species in all of creation in the Halo universe. The Elites, however, were nowhere near that, and they struggled to contain the Flood, but they were also well trained in containing it. Artas Vadum, who's actually missing a piece of his mandible, speaks about how he encountered the Flood, and particularly the stench of the Flood in Halo 2. This again shows that the Elites do have experience containing Flood outbreaks, but the different stages of the Flood that the Elites are currently fighting are nowhere near to that which the Forerunners faced. Because again, the Forerunners were facing the Flood while it was completely coordinated and it had interstellar travel capabilities, and the Elites were struggling to contain essentially Flood that were kept in research units on different Forerunner structures. You may think that the horror that is the Flood ends when a planet is essentially devoid of all of its sentient beings and biomass. That isn't quite the case. Somewhere between Stage 3 and Stage 5 of the Flood infestation, they actually begin to make things called key mines. Now, we don't actually have any
that stench? I've smelled it before.
Is what we assume it will be. Essentially, a key mine is a grave mine that has taken over every ounce of biomass on a planet, and they've essentially weaponized the entire planet, creating a massive flood hive. Now, if you see a key mine, again, it's pretty much over for everyone in your galaxy, because they kind of just drift around and wait until they make contact with another planet, and once they do, they're able to effectively destroy that planet with unlimited amounts of infection form. Because, again, every single bit of the Flood, every piece of its biomass, everything is constantly telling the key mind all the information it needs, and a planet's defenses are only going to be able to hold out so long. Perhaps a planet does have an effective defense against a key mind, but very, very quickly the key mind will slowly consume sentient biomass and gain all of the secrets to undo those defenses in a very quick and effective way. Now, There is a picture of a keymind from Awakening the Nightmare in Halo Wars 2, but it's believed that they can get even larger than this. Now, you may be wondering, how does this relate to the Gravemind that we see in Halo 2? Well, the Gravemind in Halo 2 and Halo 3 is essentially the size of a large room, whereas a Keymind is the size of an entire planet and has consumed everything that that planet has to offer. So, to put that into scale, I found this image here. Now, obviously, this image doesn't tell the whole story, but what it does show you is the difference in size between each individual flood form. The Gravemind prior to taking over High Charity wasn't exactly that big, and he was able to pretty much hide on Delta Halo without being detected by either the Covenant or the humans until he decided to yoink the Arbiter and Master Chief into their quote unquote watery grave. However, after he does consume High Charity, he's effectively the size of High Charity. Again, because the way the Flood works is they essentially terraform over biomass and consume all the effective and useful biomass that exists on a planet. Meaning that every part of the Flood, or every egg, or whatever you want to call it, essentially connects to that Gravemind. Therefore, he has the ability to see all throughout High Charity. Now, I couldn't find a image that shows quite how big High Charity is in comparison to Keymines, again, because they're relatively unseen in the Halo series. But what I could find was a High Charity image, which is compared to the Death Star from Star Wars. So enjoy that. So, the first Death Star in Star Wars was apparently 160 kilometers around. So, if we're just going to do some basic quick mental math that isn't necessarily super accurate, but just to give you guys a sense of the scale of the Gravemind, you can see here that the Proto Gravemind is absolutely tiny, but as we go over to the Death Star and the High Charity Gravemind, which is the same Gravemind, but at this point he's decided to take over all of High Charity. High Charity is approximately 4 times the size of the Death Star, so that's about 640 kilometers of Gravemind, which obviously doesn't include, a lot of the Flood that are on there that have the ability to be deployed places, because technically they are considered part of the Gravemind due to the simple fact they're also biomass. And again, that's pretty much all the Flood is. It's like one giant heap of biomass and one hive mind that controls all the different articles of biomass. So again, to reference my previous point, if you guys understand that the humans are fighting a Gravemind that's that big, you have to also understand that the Forerunners were fighting Graveminds 5 to 10 times that size, because a lot of Graveminds had hit the Keymind phase, or the 5th stage in a Flood infestation, when the Forerunners were engaged in war with them. So, to put that out there, that shows you again just kind of how little the humans actually have to encounter the Flood, and how rudimentary the Flood is in the Halo games that we're currently playing. Because High Charity obviously was like a mobile Flood army, and in the previous cutscene where Shipmaster actually talks about how Earth is doomed because a Gravemind has it in its sights, it shows you that the humans in the Covenant were far more scared of the Flood and were fighting far more barbaric elements of the Flood than obviously the Forerunners were. Because you have to think that at this point the Flood only had one essentially keymind, that's what we'll call High Charity, where it was like a mobile nest. Whereas the Forerunners were fighting thousands and thousands and thousands, truly an unknown amount of things that were 10 times the size of High Charity. The numbers were just absolutely unimaginable. And the Forerunners, again, were way more technologically advanced, but eventually they too fell. They simply didn't have the brain power, or not even the brain power, but the know-how to stop the Flood. They thought, like most things, most diseases, it could be cured, but what they didn't understand was the Flood was truly a living, breathing organism that was always one step ahead of you. So that brings me to the end of part 1 of my retrospective on the Flood. I hope you guys did enjoy today's video. Next week, we'll be going into a little bit more detail about the individual flood forms and tactics that they use to defeat both the Forerunners and at times the humans, even though in the end they obviously didn't win against the humans. But yeah. So if you guys want to see that next week, feel free to go down below, drop a like, subscribe, a comment on how you thought the video was, and if I got anything wrong, feel free to correct me down below. Turn on that post bell notification to be notified every single time I upload a video, and I hope you guys have yourselves a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching, and if you made it to this point in the video, I appreciate you more than I'll ever be able to tell you guys. So thank you so much, and have yourselves a fantastic day.